Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. On behalf of Rethinking Schools, we would like to welcome everyone to our a conversation with historian Elizabeth Todd-Breland, who co-wrote Karen Lewis's memoir, I Didn't Come Here to Lie. My name is Cierra Kaler-Jones, and I am the executive director of Rethinking Schools. Today, I'll be joined by my comrade, my friend, and Rethinking Schools editor, Jesse Hagopian, for the conversation. Today's ASL interpretation is provided by Crystal Butler and Matthew Pouncey. Please add to the chat. Let us know where you're Zooming from. Let us know why you're joining this discussion this evening. We would love to hear from you. Introduce yourself in the chat, where you're Zooming in from, and why you are joining us for the discussion this evening. Now, at Rethinking Schools, our mission is to sustain and strengthen public education through social justice teaching and education activism. Part of how we do this is through our teacher unions and social justice campaign. We have a social justice teacher union newsletter that features stories, victories, and strategies from unions, as well as study groups that engage in political study on the history and the how-tos of social justice unionism. So we're really looking forward to this particular conversation as part of that campaign. We are very excited to welcome Elizabeth Todd-Breland, Associate Professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and co-author of I Didn't Come Here to Lie, My Life and Education, the memoir of the late Karen Lewis. Welcome, welcome. So good to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you all this evening. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's just great to be in this space. You do amazing work.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
So we would love if you might start by just telling us a little about the backstory, which is really interesting, how you came to work with Karen Lewis on her memoir.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a historian, and I was writing a historical book about the history of Black politics and education organizing in Chicago. And as part of the research for this book, I was doing research at the Chicago Teachers Union, looking at their old newsletters. And so I was asked to do a lunch and learn for the staff. So I was like, great, that would be awesome. So, I'm getting myself, got my little slideshow, doing my lunch and learn. And then Karen walks in. And I was like, oh, let me straighten up, get it together. I keep doing my presentation and then, it's discussion time, Q&A, and she just takes over the floor and tells amazing stories. And these stories just really demonstrated how her own life was mapping onto the entire history that I was talking about. And so coming out of that, she was like, oh, we should talk more. I was like, I would love to talk more. So I ended up interviewing her for my first book, my historical book. She was a big part of the epilogue of that book. And a couple months later, my friend Joe Petty, who's an editor, came to me and was like, me and Karen want to meet with you. And I was like, okay. And so I showed up to this meeting and they're like, well, because we want you to work on her memoir. And I was like, oh, I would love to work on her memoir. And, it was interesting in listening to her talk about why she wanted to write a memoir. She was like, this is in 2017. So it's past the 2012 strike. She had already been ill for a little while and was in recovery and said, everyone's always asking me to like blurb their book, write a foreword to their book, write an introduction. Very caring. She's like, I'm gonna write my own damn book. So I was like, okay, let's do it. So the original arrangement was that she was going to write her own personal story, and then I would, fill in historical context, so put it in a larger frame. But about 6 months or so into our work in this manner, she had a really bad stroke. And after that, she could no longer write, but she could still talk. So we did long form interviews that I recorded, sometimes just me and her, sometimes Joe was there too. And we recorded these interviews to create content explicitly for the book. So this started in 2017. We went all the way up to February 2020 was our last in person, right before the pandemic. And so I had all this material. And then during the pandemic, had to try to put it together into book form. And I should say, Karen's a union boss. So we had an MOU, we had a book contract, I had instructions on how I was supposed to proceed. But still, it was quite the task. And it became even more difficult after she passed away in 2021, about a year after our last time together. But it was such an honor, and I still just feel so honored to be brought into this project with her.
Yeah. What an incredible job you did. And what a journey you had to go through to bring us this book, but I'm so glad you persevered with it because Karen is so dear to me and to so many other people. She was one of my most important mentors, and I'm living in Seattle. I'm pretty far away, but whenever she could, uh, she would reach out and support efforts that I was a part of. From the map test boycott, she was immediately wanting to get involved and support the fight against high stakes standardized testing. And just reading your book, like, both allowed me to remember some of the most joyful moments of my life, supporting the Chicago teachers fights and remembering her cadence and her her humor and everything. So it's just such a great gift that you've given us to get to sit with her again, even though she's gone, and and to learn many new things I didn't know about her life. And so I just wanted to ask you about um, Karen's schooling experience as a kid, right? And how did that shape her teaching and ultimately her commitment to education justice?
Yeah, I mean, Karen, thank you for that question. Karen did have a really interesting schooling experience. She went to public schools. She lived on the south side of Chicago, on what I would describe for those who know as the border between Hyde Park, which is a slightly more middle class, although at that time more working class community, and Bronzeville, which is the historic destination of Black folks migrating from the South. And she talks about her first schooling experiences going into kindergarten and being disappointed. And she was disappointed because she was like, on the first day she came home and was crying because she was supposed to learn how to read. She was like, when you go to kindergarten, you learn how to read. I'm not learning how to read. And she stayed at that initial elementary school for a couple years. Then she got kicked out because she got in a little scuffle and had to go to another elementary school nearby. And, in Chicago, most schools, elementary schools, are K through 8. So she was in that next school all the way through 8th grade. And that school, Kosminski Elementary School, she talks about how important certain teachers were to her there. They're teaching predominantly Black children. But she said, we had opportunities that at that time it was standard that you had art and music, and your primary teachers knew how to play the piano. And after 8th grade, upon graduating, they took a trip to Paris. And she talks about how transformative this trip to Paris was in opening her eyes to what sort of being independent in the world could mean for her. And so after that, she went to high school. She went to Kenwood Academy High School, or at the time just called Kenwood. And it was a new school. It was only in its second year. It was built explicitly to be a school that would encourage desegregation. To a greater or lesser extent, that happened. It still was a predominantly Black school, but with more white students than probably most schools that Black children went to. And these were really formative experiences for her. I should also say her parents were educators. And I think that really played a major role in her thinking and thoughts about education. And that as educators, her parents faced a lot of barriers that Black educators were facing at that time. It was very difficult for Black educators in Chicago to become fully certified teachers when her parents were coming up through the system. And so she saw those struggles alongside, I think, being very inspired by teachers and folks that she met in her own schooling.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I love those stories, especially of her as a child. And that particular story you shared about her being upset that she wasn't taught to read was really funny. But also how she talks about fairness and how that would show up in her classroom experience, and how she would have that white teacher who treated her differently than than her white counterparts. And so we can trace a lot of the history of Black education from a lot of Karen's experiences. And I also love too how she talked about how she would boss the other children around. So there's a lot of really fun stories that just bring her to life, or bring her back to life for all of us. And speaking of sort of tracing the history of Black education, can you talk about Karen Lewis's experiences in the Chicago Black student movement and what we can learn about Black power movement, about the feminist movement in the 60s from her personal experiences? Because she had a lot of critiques from her own personal experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you lifting this thing about fairness. I think that is something that's a thread through the entire book and through her own sort of philosophy on life and life is this real attention to what is fair and what is unfair and wanting to fight for what is fair and just. And you saw that when she was a student. So when she was in high school in the fall of 1968, there was a massive Black student movement in the city of Chicago. And this was a fight for community control of schools. So, for more Black educators, more Black administrators, for Black history and culture to be taught across the curriculum. And she was a part of this. And so they had these things called Liberation Mondays, and they would all walk out of school on Mondays. And they would meet up across the city, different Black students. And she talked about going to these mass meetings and meeting people like Fred Hampton, the head of the Illinois Black Panther Party, and being so inspired by him and learning from him. But to your point, also having some critiques of the movement, particularly towards the end. She was like, there was a moment, it's a real funny anecdote where she talks about, it came this point where all of a sudden it was like the brothers wanted to be in the front. And I was like, why do they always have to be in the front? And they act like we need to sit in the back and, make bean pies. And I said, well, I don't know how to make a bean pie and I'm not sitting in the back. Right. So these are the types of stories that she would tell. But I think to your point about feminism at that time, she says, I really thought of feminism as a high school student as something that was for white girls. Right. That it was something else that I was experiencing, even though in retrospect, she had a very strong gender critique that was intersectional in nature. And so I think those experiences as a student activist were very formative. And she also talks about how the murder of Fred Hampton had a chilling effect on her, as a student activist, and just sort of thinking about her own mortality, and that she sort of peeled back a little bit from activism. But please know she was a deeply engaged student in high school. She was in every club, right? She was the editor of the student newspaper. She was in the math and computer club. She was on student government, just like everything that she could be a part of. She was definitely a joiner.
Yeah, she was basically a savant, like just so many skills and different knowledge bases, incredible. And I'd always wondered how those social movements um, had shaped her, and I knew they must have because she was just so brilliant at speaking back to power. And I know, you know, being around Fred Hampton must have rubbed off, and I just loved that she never backed down from fights because she had that spirit in her. And I know she took it with her on to Dartmouth, where she was the only black woman in her graduating class. And I was hoping you could talk about this experience and how it shaped her understanding of top down leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. So coming out of high school, she actually, I don't think she formally graduated. She just kind of left after after junior year, which I guess is a thing you could do then, and enrolled in college. And the first college that she went to actually was Mount Holyoke, all girls liberal arts school. And she started there when I think she was 16 or just turned 17 years old. So she was a young freshman and she really enjoyed it. She enjoyed, I think, the community of women that were there. Just being, to your point, she was a Renaissance woman. She like lived on the Italian floor and learned Italian. She was
Yeah.
studying music. She was, deeply engaged in opera, right? So all of these different things. But she did leave after her sophomore year to go to Dartmouth, as she will tell, to follow a boy. And she went to follow a boyfriend up to Dartmouth. And to your point, Dartmouth was a really difficult experience for her. The institution had just turned co-ed before it had been an all men's institution, and so shifting in that environment, I think, was very difficult. She was the only Black woman in that graduating class. And to your point about top down leaderships, one of the critiques she had was actually about how they instituted co-education at Dartmouth. And she said it was very much a top down decision. And you could feel that as a student, that the men on campus, the young men on campus, did not want them there, particularly a Black woman, but women generally. And so it was a very difficult experience. But it did teach her, like, oh, at an administrative level, decisions need to be made in different ways that get people's buy-in, that have some type of discussion and engagement, because I'm seeing what I'm experiencing here when things are just forced upon people in a top-down way.
Yes. And I love how much those experiences and her critiques ultimately shape how she shows up to education, to teaching, but also as a labor activist, as a union leader. And so one of the lines that I highlighted in the book is Karen Lewis wrote, "The foundation of union work is classroom work." So Lewis shares some of her pedagogy and her approaches to teaching throughout the book. So can you tell us a little bit more about her teaching philosophy and her practice and how that showed up in the classroom?
Yeah, absolutely. I think most people, right, even here in Chicago, think of her first and foremost as the head of the CTU, this amazing political force, locally, nationally, internationally. But she taught for over 20 years, and she was a chemistry teacher, which I think also kind of surprises people because, there are stereotypes about, how scientists maybe interact with folks that she very much breaks the mold of. And I think part of this, and she credits it to her own two different experiences. One, her own experience in a liberal arts education, right? And valuing that sense of what a liberal arts education could be. And also of the many careers she dipped and dived in and out of before she found teaching. She did not go straight to teaching after she graduated college. She moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where her family was from. She got married for her first marriage. She worked at American Airlines. She worked at a drug rehab center. She said one of her favorite jobs was selling Ginsu knives. So she tried a lot of things, but then eventually did, come into teaching. And one of her first full-time teaching job was at a high school called Sullivan High School. And at the time, they were embracing a program there, an experimental program for Chicago public schools. That was the Paideia program. And this was an approach to teaching that embraced the Socratic method. And of the other things Karen tried, she both applied, got into, and then dropped out of medical school. And she said between her experience in medical school and her experience in the liberal arts setting, she really appreciated the Socratic method. And it was something that she took up and used for the rest of her career as an educator, asking questions to get people to think more deeply about things, having these Socratic seminars, so that even when she went on to other schools, I think she really took that approach to education with her. And she says, what a gift in those days to be able to teach in that way, right? To not be given a sort of drill and kill curriculum that you have to follow to the T, but to be able to explore, even in a chemistry classroom, these different ways of teaching. And so I think that is one for sure, sort of pedagogical strain of her teaching that came out very clearly. And her students, sometimes it took a little while for them to get around to it. And even some of her colleagues, it took a while to get around to it. And the other thing I would say, she taught chemistry, but she stayed with a foot in lab work. So she would work in the summers in the chemical industry to sort of she would say, to keep her feet wet in analytical chemistry, and then bring that back into the classroom with her. And the last thing I'll say about her teaching, she said, what she did every year, the first day of class, is blow some shit up. That's what I would blow something up. She's like, because, kids are like, oh, and she's like, yes, let's talk about the different types of reactions. Boom, right? So yeah, I think she was quite an amazing educator. And, recently I had a pleasure of being on a panel with her and some of her former students. And the way that they talk about her, both, of course, what they learned in the classroom, but so many lessons that they took with them beyond the classroom. And also that just she was an educator that cared, right? She was going to go the extra mile. She was going to ask, hey, you seem a little off. What's going on? Oh, how are you going to you're going to college in DC? I have some family members there. Let me connect you with them, right? So just the care and attention that she took to them, I think, is also something that students left with.
That's so beautiful. And you can tell that there's a connection between her brilliant pedagogy and her brilliant union leadership work, both in terms of like the fierceness with which she defended education because she knew the power of it and what could happen if students got good education, and also because she developed skills, I think, in the classroom that helped her be a better organizer, using the Socratic method and asking questions of people around her in the struggle, I think helped her be a better leader. And I saw that so much. And we see this in the book, and we learn about the Chicago Teachers Union history and the Chicago Public Schools history that she was a part of, like Renaissance 2010. I remember that so well. because we knew it was coming for us next, and we were just cheering Karen and the core caucus on. It was I remember the day that the core caucus won the union election, and we knew finally working people have a base of power and a champion and someone who will fight for us as teachers in the classroom. So can you share about the history of the CTU and its progression into social justice unionism, and particularly the historic 2012 strike that really, I think, put Karen on the map for people not only in Chicago but around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. Karen had been involved in the Chicago Teachers Union from the 90s, from the time that she was at Lane Tech, a large high school, the largest high school in the city, where she became a delegate and then actually became a part of the executive committee of a previous C2 president. And she, I think, enjoyed the delegate work, enjoyed, talking to her colleagues. But I think for Karen, at some point, she became a little disillusioned with the union. And so when her final teaching position at King High School, she still was the delegate, but she said even there she was kind of checked out. And it really wasn't until the core caucus came around, the caucus of rank and file educators, that it reignited her passion to get back involved in union work. And it was because it was a dramatic shift from what unionism had meant before in Chicago, but also nationally, right, in teachers' unions, which moving from pretty much strictly bread and butter issues to a model of social justice unionism, which required developing in struggle relationships with community-based organizations that have been on the ground doing the hard work of trying to improve education for their children for many years, of insisting that teachers' teaching conditions were students' learning conditions, and advocating and bargaining for the common good and for the public good. So that meant not just wages and benefits, but also for affordable housing because young people and their families needed that. Also for a living wage because families of children that were coming into schools every day needed that. For air conditioning and new books and all of the things, the conditions that what the CTU would start to call for the things that students deserved. And so that transition also built up a lot of goodwill with communities. Because for a long time, I think it wasn't always as clear what the connection was between the work that the union was doing and people's everyday lives. And that doesn't mean that teachers weren't involved in unions, and particularly I will say Black teachers, because by the mid 80s, Black teachers actually outnumbered white teachers in the Chicago Teachers Union. But it's still in our very, stark political system with a very strong mayoral, leadership, it was a sort of acquiescing to that. So to stand up and fight back against the city and fight for a different vision of education, I think was a big deal at that time. Would you mind if I just read something real
Oh
quickly
yeah,
to
no,
bring in a
that
little
would
bit
be
of her voice?
Please,
Okay.
yes.
yeah, I would love that.
Okay, great, great, great. Yeah, and I want to read something about your point about the strike. I think and I'd imagine if you were in the classroom during this time, you may relate to some of these feelings. So, bring yourself back to 2011, 2012, and what folks were facing. You talked about Renaissance 2010. Many of the market-based education policies that would spread nationally were incubated in Chicago. The expansion of charter schools, high stakes testing, high stakes accountability, punitive accountability systems were being incubated in Chicago and then spread through many mechanisms across the country. And so this is what she said leading up to that 2012 strike. In all my 22 years of teaching, I had never seen a climate as hostile to students and educators as the one created by Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of the city of Chicago and former Barack Obama chief of staff, his handpicked school board, and his handpicked CPS leadership team. We wanted what was best for the more than 400,000 school children who were honored to teach and to support, and we were prepared to fight for them. So we went on strike to fight for the type of schools we knew our students deserved. Rahm had told me that 25% of our children would never amount to anything. So why should he give them anything? Well, he picked the wrong fight. And he was about to find out what fighting for that 25% looks like. We were fighting for the heart and soul of public education. There's something to be said about underestimating your opponents. Bullies take joy in knowing that their acts of cowardice are at the expense of people that they see as weaker or inferior to them. Their faith in terror tactics is only shattered when the abused stand up and will take no more. And that's what happened when the members of the strongest teachers union in the country went on strike for 7 days in the fall of 2012. And so
Oh,
I think there's a couple things you feel in that, right? Like her power, right? And this was just her talking, right? Like to be in the front of a room commanding an audience of educators, commanding a city with a powerful argument, not just for what they were against, but what they were fighting for, you know? And that's her, and yeah, her voice is just powerful. It still gives me chills.
hmm.
Yeah, not just what they were fighting against, but what they were fighting for. That's really powerful to think about. And in line with this is a sort of a follow-up question. Karen Lewis was instrumental in spearheading the Let Us Teach campaign and thinking about fighting against standardized testing and her organizing work um, to fight against it. And so can you talk a little bit about her work on Let Us Teach and share some of the background and the story that led to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think getting involved in campaigns like Let Us Teach was something really important, not again just to Karen as an individual, but to the entire union at that point and to the core caucus that was running the union. As I was mentioned, these things incubated. And I want to say something about the way that she framed her critique of standardized testing, because I think sometimes people interpret, people pushing back against standardized testing as being opposed to assessment. And she was actually not at all opposed to assessment. She was quite the proponent of formative assessments, right? Assessments that are going to lead to improve, teaching and being clear on what students need in the classroom. It was these top down, often external tests being imposed upon the entire system, increasingly from the state or federal level, that one cost a lot of money. And I think that's a really important critique too, because she saw this testing as a tool of corporate capitalism and a tool of the market-based system that was taking over public education, and a tool, particularly at that time, to sort and punish schools and children. Because this regime of high stakes standardized testing that's coming often at the end of the year, that's not tied in any real way to the actual curriculum being taught within schools or what teachers are bringing to teaching and learning in the classroom, was also happening at a time that schools were being rated and ranked based on test scores. And then whole sets of schools were being closed or turned around based largely on high stakes testing. And so she was really good, and the core caucus and the CTU was really good at putting all those pieces together, right? Not isolating one from the other, but really wrapping all of those things together in and explaining that and having conversations with parents so that parents got on board with this once they understood these different pieces.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. And Sierra and I were just talking in preparation for this meeting about how hilarious the book is and Karen is. Her humor is just unmatched. You know, I'm wearing this hoodie that Karen gave me the first time I went to Chicago and got to meet her, and I remember just the uproarious laughter in her office of that time. And it was mostly her cracking jokes about Rahm Emanuel that just had us dying. And the way she could just dress down power and just make them seem so absurd and not powerful and make us feel powerful with her laughter was such a gift. So I was hoping you could talk about how she used her sense of humor to ridicule the power and bring people together and remind them of their strength.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, to your point, she was the queen of showing that the emperor had no clothes, whoever those emperors were, right? Um, and Rahm Emanuel was certainly a major foe to the Chicago Teachers Union, to the education justice movement. And so he got a brunt of it. But she
Yeah,
was
he did.
just she was a funny person generally. She did stand-up comedy at one point, right? And to your point, when you were around her, it was just a natural way that these jokes would sort of, come out, and her humor connected people to her, and it was just a superpower, right? To both dress down power and to make people feel close. And so I'm going to read another little section real quick just to give a sense
Yeah.
of like dressing down power. So in Illinois in around 2016, that era, our governor at the time, or who would become our governor, was a Republican, doing many of the same things that we see the Trump administration doing today in terms of we didn't have a budget for several years. He froze money to public services, massive cuts to the public sector. And he became a target of her. His name was Bruce Rauner. And she actually met him years before he became governor. And this was just a couple comments that she had about first meeting him. Okay, so she's talking about, getting ready to meet him. They're sitting in this fancy downtown conference room. Rauner sauntered in looking every bit of the hedge fund homie that he is. He spent some time discussing his background. He had gone to public school in the suburbs. He sounded like a typical middle-class kid made good. He told me at one point that he supported national board certification, etc. He told me that he didn't believe in communal anything, but that we had something in common. We'd gone to the same school. Now, it was my turn to be incredulous. I knew he hadn't gone to Kenwood, and he couldn't have gone to Mount Holyoke. But not willing to let him get to me, I asked, well, where's that? Dartmouth, he said proudly. That was before I knew he had his name plastered on several buildings. So what class are you? I was doing the math in my head, thinking, he had to be from the class of 68 or 69. And with a straight face, he looked at me and said, class of 78. Now, I was taken aback because I thought he looked so much older than I did. I'm class of 74, right? So this is just her recounting a story, right? But you see the way that she's able to sort of maneuver. And I think she used humor as a tool to show the absurdity of things and to show the absurdity of people who took themselves very seriously and also looked down on other people. And I think that was a really important gift. And then the other way I just want to highlight her humor was in her own life, in her own personal life. I mentioned that Karen ultimately had a brain tumor. This was at an interesting point because after the 2012 strike, in 2014, there was a groundswell of energy to have Karen run for mayor and to run against Rahm Emanuel. And she was up in these polls that folks were running in the summer of 2014. And so she was, out starting to campaign and such. And it was during some of these informational conversations she was having in different communities that she first realized that she, had this brain tumor and had to have emergency surgery. But in true Karen form, this is how she talked about that. Give me a moment. On Sunday, October 5th, 2014, I was diagnosed with an aggressive stage 4 brain tumor. That Wednesday, I had an operation to cut it out. My plan to run for mayor was derailed. In a way, I wasn't afraid. I named the tumor Porky because it looked like a pork chop. And it had to go because, after all, I'm a Jew and pork isn't kosher. And so I lift this up as an example, I think, of a way that humor both made her closer to other people. It allowed her to critique power. And it was a way that she moved through the world that brought her some peace as well, I think. So we all benefited from the humor, but I think it did something for her too.
No doubt. No doubt. Yeah, thank you for sharing her humor.
Yeah. And speaking of her humor, one of our audience questions is about if you could share a little bit about her family and knowing more about who she cared for and who cared for her outside of work. One of the things that Jesse and I were laughing about was when she would talk about her husbands in the book and she would talk about how fine they were. We were cracking up. So that's just more of her humor, but also would love to hear more about her family, and about
Yeah.
her personal life, who she was as a
Yeah,
woman.
for sure. And I think that, I think that was I'm so grateful that in our long form conversations, we were able to talk a lot about her personal life and early life, because without that, I wouldn't have had access to those stories and that content to sort of fill in the gaps of the book after she had passed away. But she came from a really interesting family. So I mentioned both her parents were teachers. She had one sister, but her sister was 10 years younger than her. So for a good part of her early childhood, she kind of lived effectively as an only child. And I think she spent a lot of time around older cousins and family members, right? And I think maybe that's where she got a little of that humor and being able to mix it up with the adults as well. She had cousins that she was very close to on both sides of the family. Some of the family was from St. Louis. Other parts of the family were from Oklahoma. She spent some time in both of those places that I think were formative. And she spent time with her family growing up. I think this is interesting, her sort of religious trajectory, which she talks about as well in the book. And she talks about being a kid. Her immediate family was Lutheran, but her grandmothers and were of different denominations. And she would talk about enjoying going to church with her grandparents or other family members, where there was a lot of what did you call it, pomp and circumstance. She said she liked showbiz in her religion. And she also talked about kind of turning away from Christianity, though. And she talked about she could never get with, she talked about never being able to get with big God and little God being Jesus. So she sort of moved away from religion at various times. But it's actually interesting, coming back to religion for her happened around the same time that she came to teaching. And she related those things to each other and said that in the same way that, she was into the Socratic method and questioning and pushing and researching, one of the things, in addition to the pomp and circumstance, that attracted her to Judaism, and she converted to Judaism, not because of marrying anyone or anything like that on her own volition, was because it was a religion that encouraged asking questions. And that was something very central to who she was as a person. And so she found, peace and comfort there. But to your point about her husbands, baby, she knew her husbands were fine and she let them know. She talked about their dimples, their beautiful brown skin. Oh, she knew it and she let them know it.
I love it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I was going to ask you about her conversion to Judaism, but I'm glad you covered that. And I wonder if you might also just talk about uh, her grappling with Israel and Palestine, and how she might be understanding what's happening there right now.
Yeah, I think I do want to say I think it was something she really struggled with. And she talks about being a Black Jew generally, um, and that she did in her own Jewish experience. She was in a somewhat multiracial Jewish community, but that she kind of left and came back a few times over, trying to grapple with what it meant, the actions of the state of Israel versus what it meant to be a part of the Jewish faith. And I think she was very clear that she did not believe in apartheid, and she knew that apartheid was wrong, but still had a hard time, I think, navigating that. And at some point, I think made a decision for herself to create a distinction between the state of Israel and her faith as a Jew. But I do think it was something that she grappled with, and she mentions kind of coming and leaving a few times before she was able to find a route through with her faith.
Thank you. Another audience question that's coming up is someone has asked, as a historian, how did you navigate this space between honoring Karen Lewis's voice and also interrogating the broader historical reality and possible
Mm-hmm.
myth making of Karen around the events that she described?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this was a different kind of project for me. Yes, I brought my historical thinking and historical skills. I still had to do a lot of archival research to kind of pull some things up that, weren't in the narrative, or to fact check and to find corroborating evidence on some things. But it was a different project in that this was not an academic historical text or even really a history book. This was Karen's memoir. And I was working on it in service of it being a creative nonfiction project that was written in the first person. And my job then in that way was to tell her story as she told it and as she remembered it. And I think that's the thing. I've done oral history work, and it felt akin to that in a certain way, which is about honoring narrator's voice and honoring that the truths that they're telling are their truths. So when I went back and was fact checking, it's not necessarily always fact checking exactly what happened per se. It's fact check, or an interpretation, I should say, of what happened. But like, is the date right in the year that this happened, right? Are you sure that was on that block? Let me take a look at that map. It seems like that it was that type of fact checking. And so then the parts that I was writing, because I did still, one, as much as possible in the entire book, I elevated and used her first person voice, whether that was from our recordings, from things that she had written, and then after she passed away, from her first person writing that she did for the public, from YouTube clips, because she's all over the internet, um, largely non published sources, because published sources, and you'll see I did cite published sources, but the non published sources I was able to weave in to the narrative. But I do think it was a different orientation, and it was actually really fun. Like it was creative nonfiction. There was a greater level of creativity, I think, than when I've written traditional historical texts.
Right on. Well, I have one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to turn it over to Cierra. But this is a good one about what do you understand about Karen now that you didn't understand when the conversation began? What
That's
did
a
you
good
learn from
question.
the project?
I mean, I learned so much. I'll say first thing is I feel very privileged to have spent time with her at a moment where I think she was willing to be more vulnerable than she may have been at other times in her life. She was explicit, she had been ill during the time that we were working on this together, about a year or so in. She stepped down from being the president of the CTU. Our interviews happened in from places from her office to her home to rehab facilities to ultimately the skilled nursing facility where she spent her last days. And so they were intimate spaces, right? I'm in a rehab facility, or her room where she's in a hospital bed. And so I think in those moments, and because of the nature of the project, I think she was willing to be vulnerable about her personal life, about feelings about things. Now, I will say she would also sometimes be like, "Cut the tape. Let me tell you something," and those were the best parts, right? Or she'd be like, "Don't put this in there, but let me tell you something," right? But I also think so. I guess to answer the question, I learned about her on a personal level that I never, I knew who Karen Lewis, the public figure, was. I knew who Karen Lewis, I should also say, the public figure mediated by the media, was. And I feel like I got to know Karen, the person, more. And she's a fascinating person, right? She's this Renaissance woman. We've talked about all these things she studied, but she was really she threw an Oscars party every year. That was like the big to do, and like decorated for it, and took off the next day of work because they knew they were going to be getting it popping. This weekend she would be getting ready, right, for an
Oh, yes,
Oscars
she
party. She
would.
was, yeah, she was a big fan of tennis, a big Roger Federer fan. She liked to travel. She took a year off from teaching to pursue an MFA and made a documentary. And the documentary was about her uncle, who had been in the military and I think stationed in Italy at some point in time. And she told her cousin that she thought he had to have some other kids out there. So they were going to trace his path through Italy looking for these other cousins, right? So I think, that part of her, that personal side of her, I think was something unexpected that I certainly didn't know before. And just being to have those, intimate moments with her in that very private space felt very sacred, almost, I'd describe it.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And love hearing about all of the different sort of facets of her life. And as we get ready to close out our conversation today, and really thinking about the present, about what we are all navigating, what we are all fighting, what we are all resisting, what can we learn from Karen Lewis's life and legacy
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
about social justice unionism, about teaching that we can take into the fight against fascism today?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so much, right, about that she has to still teach us about being a Black woman in these fights,
Yes.
about naming and calling out billionaires directly, about attacking income inequality, about connecting struggles across different spaces, and being clear again. And I think this was always so important with the work that she was doing, never alone, always with others. That wasn't just naming what they were against, but being clear about what they were fighting for, and an affirmative, forward looking vision about what a different future would require and would have. And so I'll actually end with some of her words on this that I think, again, still just resonate so deeply. I was mentioning earlier Bruce Rauner in 2016, and how, in some ways, certainly not the fascist elements, but I would say very clearly the neoliberal turn paved the way for what we're experiencing today, right? The increasing privatization of not just public education, but the public good broadly allowed for private capture of that, allowed for elite capture of that. And so she was fighting back against this slippery slope that we've now found ourselves in, a fully authoritarian governance at the highest levels of governing. And so this is how they were fighting back in the CTU in 2016 about against some of those, what I would call precursor elements to what we're experiencing today. And I think it still holds a lot of lessons. So this was in 2016. On April 1st, 2016, a week after we were forced to take a furlough day because of the mayor and governor's austerity budgeting, we joined with thousands of others, took to the streets and marched downtown. Workers in the Fight for 15, the campaign for a living wage, collective bargaining rights, and dignity for workers, public college professors, childcare workers, healthcare workers, other labor unions, community organizations, and Black Lives Matter activists. We believed it was time for us to unite to fight the mayor, the governor, and the billionaires who were united in a Donald Trump-like campaign to turn back the hands of time and progress and destroy public education in our communities. My message at that rally was that we had power when we were all united against our true enemies. And I think this idea, right, of multiracial organizing, of organizing across sectors, of having an affirmative vision of a forward-looking future still speaks so much. And there were also these other things that she would say that I think, again, ring true today. Often Karen would ask 3 questions about how to proceed in a moment and thinking about a strategy. And she would say, does it unite us? Does it build power? And does it make us stronger? And I think those questions are still really important ones. And the other, it's like rule of threes, the other triplets of questions that she would ask, she actually got from legal civil rights scholar and activist Lonnie Guinier. And I think they speak so strongly to our mode of analysis right now. And those questions are thinking about in any given situation, who are the winners and who are the losers? Who makes the rules to the game? And what are the stories the winners tell the losers to keep them playing the game? And it's that last question, right? About the power of narrative and what it takes to shift narrative, where I feel like she just has so many lessons for us that continue to ring true today.
Oh, we need her voice, but that's why everyone needs to read this book because it's in her. Her voice is in here and her insights have been captured so that we can continue the fight in her absence. And just really grateful for all the work you put into this and looking forward to being part of the struggle with you in the future around educational justice and against the rising fascism. So yeah, it's great to be with you today.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. This was a delight. And thank you to the audience. Y'all had amazing questions.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. This was a lovely community to be a part of this evening.
Thank you so much. Yes, there's so much still to learn. And thank you so much for capturing her voice and her vision and the humor and the joy alongside the resistance and how important that is to hold close to our hearts during these times. Thank you to you, Elizabeth, for joining us. We appreciate you. Thank you, Jesse, for co-hosting with me. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Matthew, for your always wonderful ASL interpretation and support. Thank you to our team member, Danielle, who is behind the scenes dropping things in the chat for us and making the logistics flow. And thank you to all of you for joining us. We hope that you'll continue to join us for upcoming events. We do have some events that are coming up. And in the meantime, make sure that you check out this book. The book is incredible. It's hilarious. You will be laughing out loud, but you also will be inspired. So please, please, please check out the book. The link for the book is in the chat. It's published by our comrades over at Haymarket Books. If you're interested in more about social justice unionism, please check out our book at Rethinking Schools, Teacher Unions and Social Justice. We have a special discount code for you, TUSJ Study, for 25% off of the book. There are study groups and a newsletter for folks all over the world who really want to engage in the history of and the how-to of social justice unionism. So please, please, please check it out. I hope that you'll join us for some upcoming events. Ours in Education Project, which we co-coordinate with Teaching for Change, is hosting a conversation on March 16th with Mike Africa Jr., Crystal Strong, and then you'll see Jesse again for On a Move, Repairing Histories of State Violence. We hope you'll join us for this event, and all of the links for this will be in the chat, as well as our next conversation at Rethinking Schools will be What's Wrong with AI in Schools? Join us on Thursday, April 9th for that conversation. Again, thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks for being a part of our community. We look forward to staying in touch, and we look forward to being in the continued struggle together.